welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Rail Program Delivery video series. I am Anthony Thomas and I'm pleased to introduce Juliana Barnes, a project manager with the Office of Program Delivery at FRA.
Hello, everyone.
In this video, we'll introduce the various elements that comprise the process for managing risk for FRA-funded or financed projects. A project risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more objectives such as scope, schedule, costs, and quality.
The objective of risk management is to increase the likelihood and impact of positive events and decrease the likelihood and impact of negative events as you plan, design, and construct your rail project. Why is it important to manage risk? Risk management helps project sponsors improve the reliability of project delivery. It highlights scope, schedule, and cost risks that may arise in your project and helps you to address them before they become major problems to ensure the success of your project.
Risk management also provides the FRA with critical information about your project throughout the project development process. The more the FRA knows about your project's risks, the more the agency can help project sponsors to address those risks. FRA also considers risk when making funding decisions.
Risk management is a multi-step iterative process comprised of 4 elements: risk identification, risk analysis, risk mitigation, and planning risk responses. Risk management should be conducted throughout the project development process. In particular, you should consider risk at various points in time during your project development process when project risk is likely to change and new risks can be introduced. This can include the completion of planning and concept design, the completion of preliminary engineering, the completion of final design, when you're ready to bid construction, at the start of construction, and when the physical construction of your project is at the 50%, 75%, and 90% levels of completeness.
In this video, we will introduce you to the 4 elements of risk management. Let's get into the first element, risk identification. This is when you'll examine your project to identify any unplanned events that may occur at various stages during project development. Be sure to include all project personnel and stakeholders in risk identification to be as comprehensive as possible. You can engage them by conducting interviews or brainstorming sessions to explore project risks.
Risk events are typically categorized in 3 ways: the sources of risk, segments of a project, or project phase. If you categorize by the sources of risk, they may fall into categories of requirements risk, design risk, market risk, or construction risk. If you categorize by segment, you'll know the risks for particular areas of your project. Finally, if you categorize by phase, including planning and conceptual design, preliminary engineering, environmental review, and final design, you'll better anticipate what risks may arise when.
When identifying risks, you may find that some have a very low chance of happening. Be sure to consider them as part of your risk management process. Over the course of project development, these risks may become more impactful, so considering them early in the process will help you address them later.
The primary output of risk identification is a table called a risk register. A risk register is a prioritized list of all risk events known at that time, including important information describing each risk event. As your project proceeds throughout its various phases and risks become known, you'll want to add them to the risk register. A risk register prioritizes your identified risks, categorizes them, identifies the possible outcomes, and estimates the likelihood that the outcomes will happen.
You can find a more detailed example in Appendix E of Monitoring Procedure 40C. As we progress through each section of this video, we will explain what goes into the risk register at each stage in the process.
Once you've completed risk identification, you should be able to populate your risk register with a list of identified risks, including a brief description and the risk category.
Once you've identified your project's risks, you are then able to analyze them. Risk analysis is a systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may affect your project's scope, schedule, cost estimate, and quality. In your risk analysis, you should pay close attention to the elements of uncertainty that contribute to project risk, while recognizing the context of the conditions affecting the risk.
There are several techniques to analyze risk, including but not limited to sensitivity analysis, expected monetary value analysis, modeling and simulation, and using expert judgment.
Sensitivity analysis is a technique used to determine how projected performance is affected by changes in assumptions. You may want to use this method to determine which risks have the most potential impact on the project. This will help you evaluate the potential financial impact of each risk. Then, you can rank order the risks based on potential financial impact.
Expected monetary value analysis is a statistical concept that calculates the average outcome when the future includes scenarios that may or may not happen. This method is useful for comparing the different scenarios and their potential impacts side by side.
Modeling and simulation is used to explore a real world process or system over a period of time to better understand the risk of operating that process or system. For example, you may want to model the scheduled service of a rail project.
By using expert judgment, you can apply a specific set of criteria or expertise that has been acquired in a specific knowledge area in your project. This is useful when statistical analysis may not be readily executed or easily quantifiable.
Be sure to apply the appropriate technique to quantify the total impact of project risk to the schedule and cost. Since risk events can affect both the schedule and cost of your project, you'll want to assess the impacts that your identified risk will have on both schedule and cost at the same time, as they are interrelated.
Let's briefly revisit our risk register. After completing risk analysis, you should be able to populate your risk register with the following information: the potential consequences of a risk event and likelihood of occurrence, the owners of the risks or who is responsible for each risk, and a prioritized list of risks.
Furthermore, you should also be able to update your assumptions log. An assumptions log is a document that tracks assumptions throughout a project's lifecycle. Assumptions typically require follow up or validation to determine if they will impact the project. The assumptions log supplements the risk register.
After analyzing your identified risks, you will be ready to identify mitigation strategies. Risk mitigation is proactively avoiding a potential risk, reducing the probability that a risk may occur, or minimizing the impact that a risk has on your project. Risk mitigation actions can be classified into 4 types: avoidance, transfer, reduction, and acceptance. Let's briefly discuss each one.
Avoidance is when you change your project's requirements in order to minimize or eliminate a risk. For example, you could alter the alignment of your project to avoid impacting environmentally sensitive areas.
Risk transfer occurs when you shift the responsibility of a potential risk to a third party. Responsibility for a risk can be shifted to a contractor, consultant, or another governmental organization through contract requirements, warranties, or insurance policies.
Risk reduction is a planned action that either reduces the consequences of the risk event or reduces the likelihood of the risk event taking place at all. For example, you may want to modify your project requirements to avoid construction elements that are new to your agency, like constructing a viaduct.
Risk acceptance is a conscious decision to not take action on a potential risk event. You should only accept a risk without additional mitigation if taking it on is critical to achieving your project's goals.
When deciding which mitigation strategy to use, consider the root cause of the risk, the impacts of each risk, and who within your organization will be responsible for carrying out the mitigation. At this point, you may be able to identify trends in the risk events. For example, you may find that a group of risks has the same root cause. Knowing this will help you to consider mitigation strategies that address the root cause of those risks.
After this step is complete, you should be able to populate your risk register with one or more potential actions to mitigate each risk.
Knowing this will help you to consider mitigation strategies that address the root cause of those risks. Now that all risks have been identified and analyzed, and you've identified potential mitigation strategies, you can begin thinking about how to respond to the risks. There may be a number of ways that you might want to respond to each risk. The mitigation structure refers to varying levels of response that you may implement. It is made up of 3 categories: primary mitigation, secondary mitigation, and contingencies.
Risk mitigation actions that fall under primary mitigation are actions that may occur throughout the various project phases. They should be scheduled at the earliest phase at which the mitigation activity can occur. One mitigation measure may be adding resources, such as personnel, to a project to ensure the scope of work is accomplished by a specified timeline. For example, to ensure that right-of-way is acquired in a timely manner, additional personnel could be added to expand an agency's capabilities.
Secondary mitigation measures are those that mitigate risks which result from the implementation of primary risk mitigation measures. A primary mitigation action to avoid a risk may itself create a new risk that would need to be mitigated. For example, your agency may avoid the risk of building a viaduct because you lack experience in constructing them. However, constructing an embankment instead may create new risks, like the requirement of additional real estate. The real estate risk would require secondary mitigation.
A mitigation action falling into the third category, contingencies, is setting aside an estimated amount of time and or money to accommodate schedule and or cost risks. The allocated money and time are set aside so that they can be used to overcome an increase in cost or schedule due to known risks.
When planning risk responses, you will want to identify the symptoms that may appear if a risk is about to impact your project. That way, when the symptoms do appear, you will be ready to implement the identified risk mitigation strategies.
When you've determined what your risk responses will be, you'll need to update the project management plan with any changes that your risk responses will make to your project. That will include the time and cost contingency reserves that you've identified, as well as any scope, schedule, and budget changes.
And of course, you'll need to update your risk register with the selected risk mitigation strategies for each risk, along with the symptoms that will identify that the risk is about to impact your project. Now that you know the basics of risk management, let's go through a quick quiz to review. Question 1. True or false? Every risk event is either a cost risk or a schedule risk, never both.
False. Risk events often affect both the cost of your project as well as the schedule.
Question 2. At what stage in project development do you manage risk? A. Before the completion of planning and concept design. B. At major milestones throughout project development. C. At the beginning of the fiscal year. Or D. After grant closeout.
The correct answer is B. Risk management is an iterative process which should be regularly updated, usually at key project milestones such as completion of planning and concept design, preliminary engineering, and final design, and before and during construction.
Question 3. True or false? All potential risk events that may affect a project negatively can and should be identified at the beginning of the project development process.
False. Not all risks are identifiable at the beginning of project development. Some risk events may only be able to be identified as the project progresses through the various stages. However, all risk events that are identifiable at the outset of the project should be identified, analyzed, and mitigated appropriately. By conducting a thorough and iterative risk management process throughout project development, you will increase the likelihood and impact of positive events and decrease the likelihood and impact of negative events associated with your project. Identifying risks and mitigation measures will help you to proactively achieve your project's goals on time and within budget.
For more information about risk management, contact your grant, regional, or project manager at FRA and review Monitoring Procedure 40C on risk and contingency reviews. Thank you.